Good afternoon, all. This week we're talking about Parshat Tavo. We are heading toward the end of the Chomeshei Torah, the 5 books of Moses. We are within the instructions that are going to be for future generations, as we said last week, and that's where we're going to begin, making a bridge from last week to this week, and then another bridge from this week to next week with Parshat Tavo. So this week's talk is entitled Instructions, Enjoyment, and More Instructions. We're going to look for a moment at Parshat Kitetse from last week and remind ourselves of the most salient lesson it presents. What was the overarching idea of the Parsha, and what is the connection to its last reading of Amalek? We begin by remembering that it is important to note that between 72 and 74, depending on who you go by and how you count, of our 613 mitzvot are found in last week's Parsha. These mitzvot cover a wide range of proper behaviors that we as Jews are commanded to observe, including how we share our resources, how we act humanely within an inhumane framework of war, how we care for the vulnerable, how we include all, and so much else. Many of these in the category of mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, those commandments that we are told to uphold in creating and maintaining a proper society. Further, it is significant that these mitzvot are for when we are not just within the comforting surroundings of our home, but away from our protected base, and even, especially, if you will, when you go out to fight a war. The premise being nobody really wants to do that. These mitzvot are about treating all human beings who have been created by God, kol adam nivra b'tzelem Elokim. Every human being is created in the image of God, with respect and honor, regardless of what one may think of the other, regardless of the situation, and regardless of our station in life. Even, and again, perhaps especially, in the most challenging of situations. It is this line that Amalek crossed in their treatment of the stragglers and those who were too weak to fight back as the Jews had left Mitzrayim. It is this that we are to remember, and we are to blot out those who engage in such behaviors, including looking long and hard at ourselves. Immediately after this reading, we begin this week's Parsha, Tavo. Now, we are talking about how we act in our own land, within our comfort zone, if you will. Rashi reminds us that these laws are related to the land and the people of the land and community, and can only be given once it is clear that the land is ours and that we have come to it in an honest and proper way. Further, we are reminded how we are to learn the lessons of how to treat people as well as how not to treat people. This is where we confront the tochacha, the very painful text admonishing us regarding how not to act and how to always maintain a sense of humility. Do not think of yourself above the law. Do not consider trying to get away with ignoring the law, and do not ever take pleasure in the consequences of those who may. In short, this is all about humility, how we stand before God and how God is above and dictates all. Yesterday, it was my honor to be involved with a faith dialogue group as part of my work with the Montgomery County Multi-Faith Council. And the topic of our discussion was keeping faith communities safe and embracing every individual. We chose this topic within the context of our times with so much political and cultural vitriol, and the feeling that we are above others, or that I don't want that person in my congregation, or I don't want to deal with that person. And we looked at texts from the Christian Bible, the Jewish Tanakh, Quran, and other sources as well, regarding how humility is what should guide us in our actions. How we have to welcome all members of our community and include them with graciousness and with gratitude for what we have. The tochacha is about what happens when we forget that. And I will say more about some of the texts that I used at this gathering yesterday next week when we talk about community and who is part of it. So in Ki Tavo, we begin by talking about the first fruits, such valued property as the first products that we proudly produce as our work product, and about limits and boundaries regarding these prized possessions and how we mark them for God, ceremoniously giving up our possession of them and our claim to any benefit from them, fully acknowledging all the work that was put into producing them, as well as God's hand in allowing and facilitating the process by which we were able to produce these fruits. Further, we are to observe these standards and these behaviors that they inform as we present these gifts, literally the fruits of our labor, to God with joy. As we learn in chapter 26, verse 11, and God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with great terribleness and signs and wonders. And God brought us to this place which God has given us, El Haaretz Hazot, Eretz Avat Chalach U'Davash, a land filled with honey and milk. And now, the Atah, and at this point, Hinei Haveti et Reshit Pri Adama, I am enabled to bring the first of the fruit of the land, which you, God, Asher Natatali, that you gave me, and that you allowed me to grow. And now I will set it before you, Lifnei Hashem, and I will worship before God. And in that way, we are taught, V'samachta b'chol hatov, we shall rejoice in all the good which God has given us, and unto our house, to the Levite, and to the stranger, v'hager, asher b'kerbecha, the stranger in your midst. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zichron L'Shalom, speaks at length about this joy and how it is mentioned often in Devarim. That while in our earlier Torah readings, the focus is on dictated practices and about learning the instructions about how we observe these required elements, here we are told the samachta and how we should enjoy them. Think of one, for example, who is just learning to play an instrument and is more focused on the scales and the rules of how one plays the instrument. And then later, once these rules and these dictates are internalized, one can truly begin to enjoy the products of their acquired skill sets. This is what Rabbi Sachs is teaching us. Nechama Leibowitz, Zichron L'Shalom, shares that Abravanel takes a different approach, explaining that the purpose of bringing these first fruits is not to celebrate our enjoyment, but rather to humble our selfish passions. Since the first fruits were to be the most treasured possessions, as Hosea and Isaiah teach, God commanded us to subdue our natural instincts and not eat them, but rather dedicate these precious possessions to God. In doing so, we learn important lessons about ownership, sharing, and accountability to the larger community, as well as how to limit our power. Maimonides indicates that it's very important that we include the ger, the stranger, specifically in this communal experience, and reminds us that there is an internal human background ruling to all of this ceremony, full of consideration for the feelings of the stranger and any person in the assemblage that might otherwise be ignored or excluded. In other words, immediately after we have learned about the actual wrongdoing of Amalek in not showing concern for others, we are instructed to include all and to make the other part of us in our most celebratory moments, thus investing ourselves in the welfare and dignity of others. And this was a major theme in this faith discussion yesterday, specifically around mental illness and mental wellness, how too many houses of worship will exclude, or people don't want to sit next to someone who looks different, who might smell, who might not conform to our understanding of who we want to associate with, but how we are commanded to accept all of God's children with dignity and with grace. This is the exact antithesis as to what happened with Amalek. And further, it is formulated so that we do not ultimately repeat the misdeeds of Amalek and in a sense become Amalek, the ones who do not care about others, the ones who do not accommodate the needs of those who require our help and support, and those that are vulnerable so much so that we may not even see them if we are so wrapped up in our own hubris or our own joy. So it is that in the second aliyah of this week's reading, we are told, when you have finished tithing all the tithes of your produce in the third year, you will give them to the Levi, to the stranger, to the orphan, to the widow, and to all who need, and to all who need to eat in your gates and in your cities, and that they may eat to satisfaction. Then you will say before the Lord your God, I have removed the holy portion from the house. I have given it to the Levites, to the stranger, to the orphan, to the widow, according to all of your commandments that you have commanded me, and I've not transgressed your commandments. In other words, I, with humility, have observed that whatever my attachment is to these first fruits, I am sharing them with others as commanded to do so. I am letting go of hubris. I am letting go of selfish desires, and I am seeing myself as part of the larger whole. Ki Tavo. When you come into the land, you must see yourself as part of the collective. You now have agency. You now have decision-making abilities. You must do so properly and not in the ways that create these kind of social ladders that you've seen elsewhere, or ignoring people altogether. You then say to God, look, from your holy dwelling, from the heavens, and bless your people Israel, and the ground which you have given us that will produce more fruits, because you swore this, you promised this to your forefathers. In other words, we have completed our part of the bargain. Now, God, we pray that we will be so blessed. In other words, enjoyment is not just for the individual in isolation, but rather can only truly be present when God's dictates are honored and all benefit from the produce that God blesses the B'nai Yisrael with. In other words, to remember we are part of community, all of which is entitled to enjoy. Now we come to the antithesis of this sense of enjoyment. As Rabbi Professor Mark Saperstein teaches in this Parshat, we read, one of the most powerful and frightening chapters of the Torah. 14 verses that we have just worked through, Devarim, chapter 28, verses 1 through 14, outline all the good things that will happen to the people if they obey God and faithfully observe all of the divine commandments. That's the good news. Then comes 54 verses, chapter 28, verses 15 through 69, warning of the antithesis, the curses that will befall the people if they do not faithfully observe all of the commandments. And this is the tochacha, the rebuke. This is the most terrifying litany portraying various kinds of Jewish suffering in our classical literature. Because of its content, for years, no one ever wanted to have the aliyah or to read the passage itself. And it was sometimes given to the town full. So hear the irony in this. One of the people that we are actually supposed to protect and take care of and try to facilitate their enjoyment, we're going to give this to them because they don't know any better. So I hope we all understand the irony and the lack of understanding in that. In traditional practice, it is chanted at breakneck speed in a soft voice, loud enough to hear, but only if one strains a little. The punishments explicitly threatened in this chapter include terrible diseases, conquest by merciless foreign enemies, famine to the point where parents will eat the flesh of their own children, and exile and dispersion throughout the world, leading to idolatry and enslavement, and ultimately obliteration. It is indeed difficult to hear and to absorb the terrors of these verses and the ramifications of what they implicitly indicate about the nature of the human being, even, and again maybe especially, the one who is Torah observant. Often I observe people who feel that because they are so religious, somehow they are protected from everything, somehow they are immune from everything. One only needs to look back at communities that refused to get vaccinated because God's going to protect them. And none of us is immune. None of us is immune. That's the point. The moment we forget our frailty and vulnerability as human beings, we lose a sense of our need to care for other vulnerable souls. Just as Amalek saw itself as above the need to care for others, what we see in Amalek is frightening when we consider our enemies. It is downright horrifying when we consider the reality that we find these behaviors and this lack of care in ourselves needing to be reminded to resist the temptation yielding to all of it. I remember being very impacted years ago when Golda Meir, Aleh Shalom, said, "The day may come where I can forgive Arabs for killing our boys. I don't know how I will ever reconcile our boys killing others." That is not apologetics. That is not an overstatement. It's just a sentiment given the code of behavior that we are to live by. So what's going on here? We learn in the Gemara that it is not good to constantly be so strict about our rules and regulations because it will send people away and we will lose our sense of Jewish peoplehood and destiny. Rather, we should be the exemplars of kindness, caring, and compassion, as is God, one of the names of God, as Rahmanah, the compassionate one, the one to whom we are accountable. But maybe an acknowledging and addressing reality is kindness. In other words, though it doesn't feel like it, to say the Tochacha reminds us of our human nature and serves as a warning to keep us on the path that we need to be. It is no different than, say, the discipline of a parent who fiercely loves their child. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks suggests as follows: there's a profound sense that there is something natural at work. Not by chance are the children of Israel in the land of Israel exemplars of the relationship between humanity and God. The people of Israel will always be small. We are told, and we've studied in past weeks, it is not because you are the most numerous of people that the Lord has set God's heart on you and chose you. Indeed, you are the smallest of people. The land of Israel will always be vulnerable, occupying as it does a strategic location between 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and 2 traditional bases of empire, the Nile and Tigris-Euphrates valleys. Only by almost superhuman achievements of national unity and moral purpose will Israel ever survive as a nation in its land. So it was in biblical times, and so it is today, finishes Rabbi Sacks. It's easy to be caring and giving and kind when things are going well. But what about when they are not? Which is so often the case. Do we get a pass? Do we get to be Amalek in unusual circumstances? Do we come to understand how Amalek comes to be the one who is so wrapped up in themselves that they no longer care about others who are vulnerable? The answer is no. For us, no matter what the circumstances are, we are to try to be the best we can and to strive to truly walk in the way of God, as we are taught in Sotah 14a, by doing the very things that God does to show us kindness, no matter what our circumstances are. This is precisely why everyone, no matter how poor and indigent in the traditional Jewish communities, gave from and shared what resources they had, and that there was an investment in the enjoyment of the entire community, in both giving to others and receiving from the community. This is the reason that historically the Jewish people are looked to as an example of those who care for and take responsibility for our own. As we read almost immediately before the horrors that are articulated in this Tochacha, this is one of the most foundational elements of the covenant God initially made with the B'nai Yisrael. והיום הזה השם אלוקיך מצווך לעשות את החוקים האלה ואת המשפטים ושמרת ועשית אותם בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך. Just as in the Shema that we say every day, we're always told, with everything we have, with our resources, with our soul, with our heart, this day the Lord your God is commanding you to fulfill these statutes and ordinances, and you will observe and fulfill them with all your heart and with all your soul, both what you are supposed to do and what you are not allowed to do. You have selected the Lord your God today to be your God and to walk in God's ways and to observe God's statutes, God's commandments and God's ordinances, and to obey him. You have selected. And God, in turn, has selected you this day to be God's treasured people, Am Segula, as God spoke to you, and so that you shall observe all of God's commandments. And only then will you be made supreme above all nations that God made. And only then will you have praise, a distinguished name and glory, so that you will be Liotcha Am Kadosh L'Hashem Lokecha, an Am Kadosh, a sanctified people, to the Lord your God, as God had spoke. Clearly, we in our community, generally, most of us listening, though not all people today for sure, guys, generally live a comparatively comfortable life. Nonetheless, we are aware of and we are pained by the troubles of the world, both by those suffered by Jewish populations and those that impact on any human populations of any iteration and faith community. This is what Amalek did not know how to do. And the Tochacha reminds us that we must never become that. When we say, Zachor et Amalek, remember, Ba'al Tishkach, don't forget. Because what do we say? To forget history is to repeat its mistakes. The Tochacha reminds us that we must always remember the Jewish promise that binds us, as well as the human frailty that is our nature, and we therefore must behave towards others honorably. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, good and bad. And we must engage in this behavior, whether we are at home, as in Ki Tavo, or on the road, as we were in Ki Tetzeh. Shabbat Shalom, wishing a peaceful and meaningful week to all. Lihitraot.